Thank you very much, and thank you for the very warm welcome to Galway. It's my first time in Galway, which is a bit of an embarrassment from a girl brought up in Belfast, but that's rectified now. And as Georgina said, I'm the second bioengineer to stand up with you today, and Sean and I shared an office 25 years ago when we were boy and girl prodigies, obviously, given that we couldn't have been in research for all that time. So I'm being asked to speak about how evidence syntheses contribute to priority setting, and I'm mainly going to use the term systematic review when I talk about evidence syntheses, because I find it very hard to say evidence syntheses, but you will know that that's shorthand for all types of evidence synthesis. As Georgina mentioned, most of my research experience has been in the area of tissue viability and wound care, so I'll be particularly using some examples about the effectiveness of interventions for the prevention and treatment of skin damage. But it was good to have the context of the earlier presentations today to talk about the quality of the research that we do and also the methodological challenges and toolkits available to us in undertaking other types of evidence synthesis. So clearly everybody here today, because you've engaged in a Cochrane conference, are very aware of the importance of undertaking systematic reviews, evidence syntheses. And mainly the focus that we have when we're talking about these is in order to inform clinical practice. But taking the baton from Sean's talk earlier about can you really make much out of poor quality evidence, I also want to talk through how systematic reviews have led to the commissioning of actually quite high quality research in a particular area. That is the wonderful world of wounds. Acknowledging that I'm halfway between scones and lunch, I won't have any pictures of supturating wounds. That's a real disappointment for Georgina and I, but it's in respect of some people, and that isn't really their cup of tea. But overall, if I was to summarise the presentation in one phrase, it would be: this is about trying to make sure that the right research is done right. Because actually, the research that needs to be done is almost too important to leave only to researchers to frame the question, get on with it. And I think Sean's presentation earlier showed very well what happens if you allow this to be almost like a free market economy, with researchers saying what they want to do and then doing it, because in his analysis from the systematic reviews, there's a lot of stuff that's been done badly. So I'm going to set the presentation in the context of my experience as not only a researcher in this area, a systematic reviewer, somebody who works in teams to do primary research, but also as having had the opportunity and privilege to serve with the NHS NIHR, National Institute for Health Research, topic identification panels and commissioning board. So that's the context that I'll set it in. So I'll just try and make sure that everyone's on the same page so that they understand the world in which these reflections come from. I'm going to talk briefly about the ethical and economic imperatives of ensuring that systematic reviews inform commissioning, i.e. what research gets done and funded, because I think those are interlinked. And we had some really good questions and discussion earlier about really should people be taking part in poor quality research? And I guess the answer is clearly no. But there are ethical imperatives, but there are also clear economic imperatives. I'll take us in a little journey through some wound care examples, and I'm going to restrict myself to venous leg ulcers and foot ulcers in the main. So mostly subturating things below the knee. And I'm going to finally wrap up with some reflections about this area and the impact of systematic reviews framing the research commissioning. Now, in England, we're very fortunate in that the NHS strategic mission is very clear about the centrality of health research to what the NHS does. Now, this is sometimes lost in the heat of frontline activity. So when you're speaking to clinical colleagues in district nursing teams or in wards or in community practice, sometimes you get the impression that they think that research is a luxury and that it's something that you do, something that I would do because I wasn't any good at the real nursing, okay? But the NHS is very clear that research is central to what it does. And it's doing that both because of ethical and economic imperatives. And I've lifted this slide from an NHS England document that talks about the centrality of research and what they do. And what struck me about this was that it was very clear that NHS England wanted to drive the direction of research, setting out what were the research questions that needed to be done, and building an NHS environment that allowed research to be done, and then trying to make an NHS where people can implement research. And if you look at the bottom left here, it actually says that ensuring that research that's commissioned addresses the future needs of patients and local NHS systems. So that speaks to my point about the research that's done is almost too important to leave to researchers to decide what they want to do. And so I'm going to reflect a bit on how that happens. How do you ensure that research is done so that it addresses the needs of the NHS? The short answer is money, but there's a longer answer, and I have been asked to speak for 30 minutes or so, so I better string it out a bit. So the NHS England has set up a mechanism by which all of these things can happen, setting the context for what research needs to be done, putting in place the things that need to be there so that research can happen, an NHS that can support research, and an environment where research can be translated into practice, that it could be used to good effect for patients and the public. And so this is the dreadful diagram that we have that tries to represent all of the wonderful bits of the National Institute for Health Research. Importantly, what they've realised is that you have to put patients and public at the core, and then there are some infrastructure things around the outside. So at the bottom, there's health systems, particularly speaking to some of our earlier presentations about faster, easier clinical research so that you don't spend 10 years getting towards the answer, by which time it's out of date. There's infrastructure on the left-hand side, things like clinical research networks that will support the conduct of research. Importantly, at the top, there's faculty, i.e. people. This doesn't happen without people. It's a people business, that's what we're in. And on the right-hand side, where I'm going to end up is with the research programmes. So sorry if you're not good at reading it. This one says research programmes. So that's where pieces of research are funded. And there's a lot of funding programmes that are tailored to take research ideas, research teams, research projects from early discovery science, in finding a new molecule that does something fantastic, or determining that there's different ways of delivering information about fruit and vegetables, or policy that would give all of us a Fitbit, age X or whatever, so that we can monitor how slothful we are. All the way through to public health, and Cochrane review groups are in there as well. So there's a huge amount of activity. The experience that I can draw upon is from the Health Technology Assessment Research Programme, which is this one here. And health technologies in this context might mean different ways of delivering clinics for leg ulcers, or different ways of having surgery for your shoulder when it gets stiff and doesn't rotate. It might be drugs, etc. So I'm going to draw upon the experience of being on the HTA commissioning board, i.e. Commissioning research, but also in the topic identification panels. And they are responsible for commissioning both primary research and secondary research, evidence syntheses, systematic reviews, models, etc. And remember, I promised you that we'd talk about ethics and economics. For me, the NIHR, which I've just showed you that terrible diagram showing all the complexity, which is now 10 years old as of April, has been spectacularly successful at ensuring that research is at the centre of what we do in the NHS, because 10 years ago, when Best Research for Best Health was published, I think that's the little report up there, published in January 10 years ago, what it started to set out was that doing high quality health research would not only drive better health, but better wealth. And I think that's a really interesting pulling together of things that get the attention of politicians, who at the end of the day will be responsible for ensuring the longevity of things like the NIHR and research funding, and having research at the centre of what we do in the NHS. And so this juxtaposition of better health and better wealth has then been seen in a number of reports coming from NIHR, and has been very successful in actually opening out NIHR facilities to commercial trials that are done well, and also ensuring that NIHR funding has been relatively protected even in times of austerity, because the Chancellor of the Exchequer has been very clear that this is one of the drivers for UK PLC, which is a horrible term, but it's a way of ensuring that as a country we can remain competitive in these sorts of biotech industries, etc. But that's been immensely important, I think, for the sustainability of this endeavour. And the NIHR at 10, there's a wonderful report setting out all the achievements, the 15,000 health technology assessments, etc., that have been done over that time. It's a really good read. So let me get into the nub of the research commissioning now. I've set you the context in which I'm talking about NIHR and NHS England. So now, thinking about research commissioning, what's that all about? It's about a very active driving of what research questions are going to be asked and getting the right research done right. If you think about the olden days, in the olden days when I was a PhD student sharing an office with Sean, mostly researchers came up with great ideas, And then they sought funding. And a panel would say, oh, they're a great team. They know what they're doing. Let's give them some funding. But research commissioning is like at the other end of that spectrum. You've got researchers know best. They'll ask for money. And then you've got research commissioning over here, which says, we need this question answered. Who's going to come and answer it with us? And in the middle, you've got something that's almost like a halfway house, which might be a themed call that says, we need more research on dementia and obesity in children. None of you are researching it, but there's a pot of money here. So if you bring forward good ideas, we'll fund it. Because I think everyone in this room will be aware of the research that's been done that demonstrates that disproportionately academic researchers, like me, spend most of their time researching esoteric things, esoteric outcomes that affect not very many people, but will get a very sexy publication. Right? Does that ring a bell? I think it does, right? So if you're actually researching something that matters to most people, it's very dull. And there aren't very many careers built upon things like that. But research commissioning says, no, we're going to put money to where we can close knowledge gaps that will bring the best health gain. So there's some fantastic work done on the value of information and the expected value of information to close knowledge gaps that Carl Claxton at York, for example, has been doing for a large number of years. But in words of one syllable, stuff that I can understand, it says, where do you get the best bang for your buck? Yeah? And it's really important in that research commissioning that you're also clear about who you're going to ask to help in the prioritisation of these research questions. Are you going to ask researchers? They're fourth on my bullet list there, because they might have their own agenda that says, well, actually what you need to do is research venous leg ulcers, because they're very important to me and my patients. But we should be asking public and patients, it's their money we're using. Charities have got a real powerful voice. Industry are really important as well in there, particularly around horizon scanning. So this isn't just thinking about in 5 years' time. What about in 15 years' time? What research do we need to be thinking about now to inform health delivery in 10, 15 years' time? And the people who will actually provide care, so commissioners or providers of health care. And in the experience I have based in the NIHR system, we bring together public and patients, clinicians, charities and researchers into NIHR prioritisation panels. And so there's ones on elective care, interventional procedures, which mostly means surgery as far as I could see, but they didn't call it surgery for some reason. Maternal, neonatal and child health, mental, psychological and occupational health, and primary care, community and preventive. And those panels try to ensure that questions of real importance to researchers and to the public and patients and commissioners are brought forward, not the, oh, I really would like to do a study on X. And one of my conversations in one of those panels, there used to be one called the External Devices and Physical Therapies panel, and a proposal was submitted that we should prioritise a piece of research that was, to summarise, is exercise good for people with X, condition X? And the public member said, he said, I'm really bored now of all of these proposals for people suggesting, is exercise good for X? He said, from everything that all of the experts have ever said, the answer's going to be yes. because exercise is good for everybody, you know, and if you get a lot of pain when you're doing it, stop. You know, it's actually quite simple. Should we just stop prioritising, is exercise good for X? So the questions are probably more like, how do you get me doing more exercise? Not, would it be good for me? Because I think we know the answer to that. So real sort of wisdom when actually I wanted to know, is exercise good for? Because I was interested in it, not patients. So those NIHR panels bring forward topics which are then dealt with at a prioritisation group, because clearly you want to ensure that there is both a balance of topics coming forward around various areas of import to the NHS, such as public health, primary care, mental health, as well as physical health, elective and emergency care, as well as planned long-term care. So it's a real balancing act to ensure that each part of important priorities are dealt with. And these might end up commissioning primary research, or they might end up commissioning systematic reviews if actually the state of knowledge isn't very well understood. But there are lots of challenges. We would understand that if you just look at those 5 panel topics: mental, emergency, elective, maternal, etc. There's thousands of different populations or descriptions of populations and problems that people present with, potential interventions, potential outcomes. And there's only so much time, and there's only so many research teams able to take up that challenge and do high quality research, and there's only a limited number of participants. So it's all about the prioritisation. If I were a singer, it's all about the bass, but it's all about the prioritisation. And that is challenging. There's absolutely no doubt that that's challenging, but because it's difficult doesn't mean to say we shouldn't be clear about it. Actually, in my experience of the panels and commissioning boards when I was on them a few years ago, was that often we reached the limit of high quality questions that would make a real difference before we reached our funding limit, which is really sobering, because often there was more funding that could have been used, but there weren't the high quality proposals coming forward. And the HTA commissioning board, for example, would not spend money if it wasn't of the highest quality research. So I'm now going to take us into a little wander about wounds. Is that okay? Okay. So a series of systematic reviews and systematic appraisals of the state of the art that probably was started about 25 years ago, 20 years ago-ish, by Dame Nikki Cullum, who's now at the University of Manchester, identified that venous leg ulcers were a big issue. We already knew from some research from the Lothian and Forth Valley leg ulcer study, where I cut my teeth as a leg ulcer specialist and first became aware of Sean's work, was that venous leg ulcers are a big problem. They're mostly hidden, but more than 40% of district nursing time in the UK is spent managing venous leg ulcers, and nobody really cared about it. Nurses went on and did it, everyone just kept their mouth shut, and it was like we were using truckloads of dressing packs every week just to stem fluid pus and coming out of venous leg ulcers. But the real extent of the problem became apparent, and these evidence syntheses also started to show that we didn't really know what to do with them other than to wrap them up. So the wisdom at the time was that compression was important, basically squeeze the blood back up towards the heart. But we didn't know of anything else that people did, and people love doing stuff to venous leg ulcers, because if you go into nursing to look after wounds, like Georgina and I, you just love fiddling. If I put a bit of this on, will it help? If I put a bit of that and that, will that help? It's the New York delicatessen approach to care. So venous ulcers, compression seemed to be key, but does it help if you put dressings on? Does it help if you put maggots on? Maggots became very sexy for a while. Does it help if you take aspirin? Because aspirin has something to do with blood flow, and venous ulcers are something to do with venous blood, blah, blah. Does it help if you have surgery? Does it help if you have ultrasound therapy? So this like wand that you put, ding, 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 ding. Will it help? So the HTA, Health Technology Assessment Programme, started commissioning some trials in this area. So they commissioned a couple of trials on compression systems, which one to use, because we thought compression was important, but not which one. Is a big fat one better than a thin one? Big fat one, you need to change your shoe size. It's not very sexy. You can't go to weddings. Thin ones, do they work as well? But they're hard to get on. Those sorts of things. Maggots, do maggots help? Does aspirin help? Does surgery help? Does ultrasound help? Lots of trials. And venous leg ulcers are an interesting area to work in because there are so many things that you can try. You will probably be aware that medical devices aren't subject to the same barriers to entry to market as drugs are. So if you want to sell a drug, you sort of have to show that it's better than nothing. If you want to sell a device to somebody, you have to show that it's, hang on a minute, you have to have a CE mark on it. That's about it, right? That says it's not going to electrocute you, and it's clean, and it's definitely not going to have fibres shed off it, and that's about it. Very low barrier to entry to this market. So you've got, if you're somebody that loves trying new stuff, there's always new stuff in wounds, and a lot of nursing has this issue. Low barrier to entry, very rapid innovation and invention, but you don't know if things work. Colleagues in Wales developed a really interesting way of turning maggots into medical sterile maggots, but they would still be active. So really fantastic work, and you can see them identified here on the right as nature's little surgeon. Isn't that cute? He's fantastic. And you can see here that the people that made the maggots have got a maggot crossing the finishing line, and just behind him you've got some maggots in a bag. It's like a sack race for maggots, because somebody else came up with maggots in a tea bag, because nurses don't really often like putting maggots onto wounds. But if you put them in a tea bag on a wound, you sort of, right, it's done, right? It's a bit more acceptable to the nurse. Patients don't care, actually. And then at the back, you've got jelly in a tube, which was the comparator. So this was an interesting advert that came out just exactly at the same time as the HTA commissioned a trial to say, are maggots any better than gel? And so we were a bit annoyed, because they're basically saying, buy our maggots, they get to the finish line first. Don't buy any of those things in bags. So actually, after discussion with the HTA, we ended up doing a 3-arm trial of maggots, not in a bag. I called them free-range maggots, because I'm very organic. Maggots in a bag and gel. So is there any difference? Crucially, what the HTA commissioning process does is it makes sure that you're focused on outcomes that are important to patients, not outcomes that are important to the manufacturer. So the sorts of things that had driven the previous trials, before this trial, for example, the largest one had probably had between 12 and 20 patients in it, and had followed people up for, a couple of weeks. So venous leg ulcers can take 50, 60 years to heal. Right? So following somebody up for a couple of weeks isn't terribly informative. So the commissioning of this research meant that the outcomes were very clearly patient-focused. Does it heal? That's what people want. Is it painful? Because that's really important. And does it cost any more? Because that's hugely important to commissioners. So do they clean the ulcers more quickly than gel? Because that was also interesting to report. But really, is it any better for healing, quality of life, pain costs, and adverse effects? So we know what the prior belief was of the manufacturers. So we'll, I'm trying to remember if I've got the punchline at the end. But what do you think the results of this trial were? No difference for healing at all, at all, at all. Right? Cleaned them up much quicker, so nurses felt great. Look, I've done that, it's clean. So it was clean and open, rather than dirty and open. Didn't make any difference to the patients. They want it closed. And the maggots were more painful and more expensive. Okay? So if you want to heal the ulcer, doesn't matter what you do, cleaning it up quicker isn't what you do. So just another couple of examples, and I'm mindful that I'm going to get waved at with because that lady is really scaring me with the, and you can see that I'm actually a very shy person. I don't like talking very much. But some other examples of commissioned systematic reviews in this instance, so commissioned by the Health Technology Assessment Programme, and then what they found. So at the top, there was a commissioned series of systematic reviews setting out the effectiveness of treatments for wound care management. Very clearly, little evidence to indicate anything about do dressings, treatments, debriding agents help these wounds. And so it is almost like we're back in the 60s, right? Even though these were published in 2000, we just didn't know anything that we were doing with these wounds helped at all. So the HTA commissioned a couple of really interesting trials. So we'll come back to some of my trials later, but these are really, really superb and interesting trials. The one on the left is about silver dressings for venous leg ulcers. Silver dressings in the UK cost the NHS about £30 million a year in prescribing costs because there's silver in them. Should be antimicrobial, should help, does it? So this trial set out to evaluate that. And the one on the right-hand side was for diabetic foot ulcers. Do you need to have a simple dressing, a sophisticated dressing, or a really sexy sophisticated dressing, right? With real cutting-edge technology in it. So these are the summaries of results of all of the foot ulcer and leg ulcer research that's been commissioned by the HTA. So the venous trials compared 4 layers of bandages, better than 2, short stretch, and found 4 layer was better. So actually the higher compression that you seem to get seemed to be helpful. But when you compare 4 layers of bandaging versus compression hosiery, like really high-grade medical compression hosiery, and this was a 2-layer system, there was no difference. Now, it's really interesting, I worked on Venus 1, and what we realised during that was that nurses often wanted to be working on a trial that found that one treatment was better than the other. And we had to really get people into the mindset during that trial that if you work on a trial, and the same will be true for systematic reviews, and you establish that actually there seems to be no difference, clinically for us as nurses, that was a really good result, because you could then tailor the treatment to your patient and your circumstances, knowing that there was no differential benefit for that patient. But that was a real turnaround, because their whole thinking was that you do a trial to find the best treatment, right? But what if they're both good? I'd go, that's fantastic. That means that if you look at a model of evidence-based practice, you can say, what's important for this patient and what does my setting allow me to deliver best, right? But that was a really powerful learning experience for me, because I hadn't appreciated that the whole language about trials was about finding the best. And if you didn't find that one thing was better than the other, people thought that you'd failed in your trial, but you hadn't. You'd found that both things were, essentially giving you the same outcome. So you could choose the cheaper one, you could choose the simpler one, you could choose the one that was most comfortable for that patient. So I digress. Venous 2 was the larvae, no benefit for larvae, loose larvae, the free-range ones, same as bagged larvae, and no benefit for healing, more painful and more costly. They did clean things quicker, but so what? And it was a really good example in wound care for us of hitting the target and missing the point. If I heal it quicker, that's what patients want. If I clean it quicker, I feel good about myself. Patients not interested particularly. Quality of life wasn't any different. It wasn't that it was reducing smell or anything. The aspirin trial, the AVERT trial, now that ceased recruitment, and that may be publishing the results for that now, but I think it's really challenging to research in this area when a lot of our patients are already maybe on lots of drugs for other conditions. So that's one of the areas we don't have a clear answer yet, despite some early indications saying that low-dose aspirin was beneficial for leg ulcers. The venous surgery trial is now in the follow-up phase, so we're awaiting the results for that, and I'm getting the wave from the lady at the front. And for ultrasound, 373 patients, no difference. I have never seen a Kaplan-Meier curve and another Kaplan-Meier curve so close in all my life. There was nothing happening at all, at all, at all. Venous ultrasound didn't work. The silver trial, no benefit for dressings that have silver in them. So £30 million worth a year in the NHS on silver dressings, and silver dressings didn't seem to be offering any benefit in healing, and they were more expensive. And in the diabetic foot ulcer study that I showed you, again, no evidence of any difference at all. And in their study, they recommended that because actually quite a few of the patients were replacing their own dressings in between visits from the nurse, actually probably the simplest thing to do is to go for a cheap dressing that patients find easy to change themselves. So we've done a lot of work in venous leg ulcers in the last few years. And we found that a lot of things don't offer the initial benefit that they thought they would. And I'm going to have to skip over the infected diabetic foot ulcers, which I'm distraught about. But just in one sentence, this is a really nice example of the HTA commissioning the systematic review and decision analytic model. And we did that with colleagues with the University of York and when I was based there, and it clearly established that there's practically no evidence to inform identification infection. And then the HTA subsequently commissioned a beautiful little study, because I would say that, wouldn't I, with 400 patients that had both tissue samples taken to identify infection and wound swabs to see if there's any difference. because the clinical practice guideline says you all take tissue samples and all the humans go, yeah, take a swab. And everyone just keeps quiet about it. So that's a really nice study, and that's just been published. And tissue samples finds more guff, but does it make a difference? We don't know. So they've now called for a randomized control trial. So I'm flying home tonight, and this weekend I'll be working on the final bits of our proposal to do a randomized control trial of comparing swabbing with tissue sampling to see if it makes diddly squat difference. Because if it makes no difference, we can go back to using swabs and actually saying it out loud, rather than pretending we're following clinical practice guidelines. So I'm going to finish up with a few reflections, and I'm out of time, so I'm around for lunch, but please get me then. In our area of wounds, it's a really interesting environment. The systematic reviews and evidence syntheses, on the whole, have consistently identified a lack of high quality evidence to guide practice. Okay, it's mostly been on, we do this because we always do this, with a bit of a smattering of, I've seen this fabulous thing at a conference, and trying it out. A huge number of commissioned trials that have now been supported mainly through the Health Technology Assessment Programme in England have helped build up a good, strong evidence base. And the systematic reviews which have followed the publication of those trials consistently note they're high-quality trials. So hopefully in Sean's table of shame, they wouldn't feature. Hopefully not. But those commissioned trials have generally identified an evidence of lack of benefit, so that the sexy thing that everyone thought would be the saviour has not materialised. It hasn't actually promised. It hasn't delivered what it promised. Now, in the wound care world, that has gone down like a lead balloon, right? Because research was supposed to tell people what was better. And what that's actually led to is scepticism about the value of reviews and trials, and saying reviews and trials aren't adequate for our area because it's so complex, which might not be the case. I mean, you know, there are other more complex areas. So it's really interesting. As a community, we're still working in order to ensure that people don't look at the emperor's new clothes. I hope that star has, yes, sure. That could have been a career-limiting slip. We don't have a lot of scepticism about treatments. We have a lot of scepticism about methods because we're not getting the right answers. So that's really, really scary place to be. We haven't realised that, like the rest of health research, and this is a beautiful little cartoon from Hilda Bastian, promising treatments are the tadpoles, they're the larval stage of a disappointing one, and you just got to get over that. It looks bright and shiny, and it's not. And it's a bit like all those boyfriends you had when you were 15. You thought they were just amazing, and nothing convinces you that that is not the case, that actually spending more time with them. Yeah? So if you actually study stuff, actually it turns out to be disappointing. So thank you very much for this opportunity to share with you some of my experiences and reflections on the really good work that has ensued from having research commissioning being based upon high quality systematic reviews, bringing important areas to the fore like the work of district nurses and community nurses. Systematic reviews are only one element of this endeavour. Things like the James Lind Alliance, priority setting partnerships, horizon scanning, lots of other parts of the NHS are driving this hugely. Systematic reviews are one important element in it, but I hope I've shown you that those systematic reviews have actually informed our evidence base and we can confidently do a bit more on wound care treatment and hopefully save people money, time and effort and improve care. Thank you very much. Thank you.